All right. So we are now on the fourth section of the flipped classroom. Right about this time, you might be saying to yourself, wow, this one's pretty long. And you are right. Chapter 22 is very, very, very important, and it covers a lot of different key concepts in your period 4 packet. So hang on for the entirety of the ride. Now, at this point, you might also notice that the slides are slightly out of order. I changed the order of them. So we're going to go over the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the hostile takeovers before we get to the Seven Years' War. So just so you know. All right. So eventually, the Europeans, like we talked about when we learned about the Dutch and the tulip boom, started using joint stock companies. Joint stock companies lowered risk, right, and maximized profit. So they were good. Good for mercantilism. And these joint stock companies, I don't want you to think about them as being private companies. Um, these joint stock companies were definitely a mixture of public and private. So why did they get started with this? Well, after the Spanish sponsored the first Columbian and subsequent voyages, the European interest in transatlantic travel went it skyrocketed. So they were really, really, really looking for this. Um, they wanted to these rulers wanted to control their domestic and colonial economies, and by doing that, they would set up these merchants to compete against each other in global trade using these joint stock companies. So, joint stock companies were a way for merchants to compete and therefore countries to compete on the economic or global scale. And these joint stock companies were incredibly powerful because the people who were investing in them were both government and private organizations, right? These workers were the same. They were the same shareholders. So the people who were working in government were the same shareholders as these individual, as private citizens. And they had tons of power. They had their own armies, they were setting up their own colonies, and they were working with trade. These things were monopolies and they were incredibly powerful. So hopefully that's stuck in your head. How do you think this is similar to NASA and the space race? Okay, so Dutch East India Company. So there's Amsterdam there. We saw that. We actually saw this map in our lesson in class. So they controlled like some regional trade networks, and then they were controlling. Uh, they had set up their biggest area was Batavia in the Dutch East Indies. This was where they were shipping things in and out of. Like they'd bring things from Japan to Batavia and then from Batavia to Amsterdam. And they controlled, like we learned about in class with the nutmeg article, they controlled a bunch of different spices. Um, but they were using this control to um, to to purchase other stuff and then bring it back to Europe and sell it. Um, so you can see you can kind of go um, through this. Yes. So they were bringing things from these places and selling them. Like in Arabia, they were selling them spices and they were buying coffee and silk and bringing it back to Europe. In India, they were bringing them silver from the Americas and they were buying, actually, Japan, sorry, they were bringing silver from Japan. They're not Spanish, so they don't have big mountains of silver. And they were buying, yams and silk and indigo and peppers. They were bringing to Ceylon cloth from India and then buying spices from them to bring to Europe. Um, Same with Batavia. They were um, buying spices and selling them cloth, silver, and ivory from Africa, etc., etc. Okay, so you kind of get the idea here. The Dutch East India Company is one of history's largest companies. Here's Apple. Here's the Dutch East India Company. So market capital, right? Biggest East India Company. You might say to yourself, wait a minute, that flag looks familiar, but it's weird. That is the British East India Company flag. And I just want to show you this map so you can see the different European settlements here and maybe get the idea of like, oh, there's going to be some competition here. The British East India Company was all over, just like the Dutch East India Company. I mean, we obviously holdings in America, the British East Indies, the, you know, in the Caribbean and South America, but India is where this is really gonna, there's gonna be really some competition because you've got all kinds of Europeans there. Okay, so what areas did these Europeans control? Well, here's just a few examples. The Spanish obviously have a bunch of holdings in the Americas, which we're going to get into in chapter 24, but they also control the Philippines. And this is really, really important to them because they would bring silver from the Americas to the Philippines, and they would use their galleons, those ships from the Philippines, to trade with China. And so here's China, here's the Philippines, right? And they would then bring those goods back to the Americas. So silver was financing trade with Asia. American silver was financing trade with Asia. And the Spanish still had silver left over. We'll look at why that is or how much silver they had in chapter 24. Their capital there was Manila. And they used the ships called galleons, which we learned about in class. Manila galleons were those big ships that they were using to transport silver and goods. They focused on conversion. The Spanish were very, very focused on conversion. And so that's why the Philippines are mainly Catholic today. Indonesia was controlled by the Dutch. They wanted to control the spice market. Remember, that's why they gave away, they had a treaty to give away New York City, which was New Amsterdam. And they wanted nutmeg, and then eventually they started growing rubber in these places once the Industrial Revolution happened. But this is later on. Later on. At first, it's like spices like nutmeg, like we just saw. And they used a lot of forced labor, and they were incredibly rigid and cruel in doing this. You can read more about that in your book. And they were also the only ones allowed to trade with Japan, which we'll learn more about in chapter 27. Also, the Russians. The Russians expanded mainly on land during this time in Asia and Siberia for resources like furs. They actually had some animals go extinct because they took so many of them. This was also an area where they would send convicts like debtors or government dissenters. And so the phrase being sent to Siberia, it was literal in Russia. You literally could be sent to Siberia, this super duper cold wasteland like North Dakota or Manitoba times 10. So don't go to prison in Russia, I guess. Here's a convict village. Okay, the last area of conflict, and then we'll stop this flipped classroom, this section of the flipped classroom, and lastly go over the Columbian Exchange, was the 7 Years' War. This happened at the very end of the time period, very end, way later on, because of commercial rivalries at sea between mainly France and Great Britain. And it was a war that happened on multiple fronts in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America, and Europe actually saw the least amount of fighting. It was part of the French and Indian War in the Americas, and the British emerged victorious. Let's just say the 7 Years' Wars is one of those turning points in history, that if the French had won this war, they would have been the global dominators, but the British won, so they're not. These are all the areas where fighting took place and what countries sided with whom. So green is France, people siding with France, and blue is Great Britain. And so there was fights in South America, there were fights in North America, Africa, India, Philippines, all that stuff. Okay, last but not least, we're going to do the Columbian Exchange, and we're going to stop the PowerPoint here, and we're going to start it again, and that'll be your last couple of minutes.